I'm glad you're all here. It's exciting. My name is Rebecca Rice. I work at a company called True Matter. We are a UX consultancy in Columbia, South Carolina, not too terribly far from here. We help clients in a number of industries make their digital products better, more usable, more accessible. We do this through user testing. We do product reviews where we'll go through and review their product, give them our assessment based on what we've seen in previous user tests. We even build products from the ground up. So today, I'm hoping, how many of you are developers here? Perfect. Okay. It'd be weird if you weren't, but if you're not, this won't be too terribly over your head. A lot of the fundamentals I'm going to talk about today apply to anyone here, no matter what your preferred scripting language is. So all of the examples I'm going to show are HTML, and you can think of that as what should ultimately be rendered in the browser, despite whatever you're coding in. I'm going to show some very simplistic examples, because I feel like a lot of times we, through our careers, kind of forget these basics, and these are really at the core of accessibility and what we all need to be practicing to make sure that we're creating inclusive digital products. I'm also going to go over some of the biggest issues I see when testing and helping clients remediate their products, and talk through kind of how to solve them and just how many options you have. So that's the great thing about accessibility. It takes a creative thinker, ultimately, to figure out what the best solution is. So just to give you a little background, it's estimated that there's over 1 billion people with some form of disability in the world. This does not include situational disabilities. So how many of you have broken your wrist or your hand or fingers ever in your life? Using a mouse and a keyboard was super fun, right? Really easy. So that's something that can happen at any point in any of our lives, and that makes you disabled. So that would mean using the mouse is hard, you'd resort to using the keyboard. If a site or app doesn't work with a keyboard, sucks for you. It's estimated that there are over 40 million people in the US with a disability. That's 15% of the population here in the US. So all of this is to emphasize that if you aren't already making accessible digital products, you're kind of being a jerk. Sorry. But you are leaving out 15% of the population here, and you're on the wrong side of the law. The ADA was passed in 1990, and it originally applied to services within a place of public accommodation. So think curb cuts, think, accessible doorways, stuff like that. And most recently, January, the Ninth Circuit held that the ADA actually applies to services of a public place of accommodation, specifically Domino's. So Domino's, you can order a pizza online. They have this app where you can track it and all this stuff. It's not accessible. Surprise. So this actually sets a really strong precedent that regardless of the industry you're in, government, nonprofit, or not, you have to have an accessible site or application if it is for public accommodation. Any of us that release a product to customers, that's for public accommodation. So that could be you. On top of that, obviously, you could lose business. So what they're doing right now with a lot of these lawsuits, I didn't mention, since 2017, they've actually tripled to over 2,000 active lawsuits right now, just for ADA compliance of websites. So they're just now starting to get into applications. But what that means is if they find that your site isn't accessible, what they're recommending right now is actually the WCAG guidelines to remediate that as a remedy for making your site or application accessible. And those are the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. I'm going to talk about those a lot because they're being adopted by a number of governments to apply to their laws on accessibility. And they're kind of setting the standard globally for what we should expect from accessible products. They've also been adopted by Section 508 in the United States. So if you work for a government agency or you work at a nonprofit, these apply to you too. So losing business, we all care about that. So if you don't care about being a jerk, that's fine. If you don't care about, getting sued, you at least probably care about this. One of my favorite things, so we hold a UX panel every quarter in Columbia. We usually invite UX practitioners, developers to come and hear about different topics, user testing, user exercises. We most recently did one on accessibility, and we had a panel of disabled men and women come and talk to us about how poor accessibility has affected their everyday lives. And it was really eye-opening. They did a lot of demonstrations for us, which I'm actively tweeting right now. So in a minute, I'll show you my Twitter handle if you want to check that out. A lot of the resources will be going out during the talk just to save time. But one of the women there was going to show us screen reading on her iPhone, which, yes, guys, people do that. They use their iPhone actually more than computers most of the time because they don't need that giant 27-inch monitor if they can't see it. So they're using VoiceOver on their iPhone. They're using TalkBack on Android to read the things on the screen. And so she was going to show us an example of a bad application. She couldn't find one on her phone. She actually said that, they don't get my money. This is an accessible phone. So if this app isn't accessible, I don't download it. So that means a lot for your customer base. It's 15% if you're just targeting the US alone that aren't going to use your product because they can't. So just again, to give high level, I assume that if you're here, you know something about web accessibility already. So I'm not going to really talk about too much different types of disabilities and different rules of accessibility or guidelines, but I'm going to go over kind of the four main principles, and these are from WCAG 2.1. The first being perceivable. Can I interact with your site or application using at least one of my senses? So if I'm blind or low vision, can I hear it? If I'm deaf, can I read it? If I have mobility issues or troubles using my hands or a mouse, can I use a keyboard? So it's basically, can they get to the content? If you think about it that way, can they absorb it in some way? Is it operable? So this one kind of makes sense. Can they use it? Obviously, this applies to everyone, not just those with disabilities. But this specifically, when it comes to accessibility, applies to can they use the keyboard? Do they have enough time to interact with the product? So one of those things that I think universally are hated is that little timer when you go to buy tickets, right? So if you don't fill out that form quick enough, you don't get your tickets, you have to start over. Those are even worse for people with disabilities. Think about your mother or your grandmother if you're super young. They're going to have a hard time already probably interacting with that, but then you're going to put a timer on them and stress them out even more. Same with drop downs. So those the big super drop downs that everyone uses. So if you don't give someone enough time, say they have a handshake, this can be Parkinson's, MS, a number of issues. If they can't get into that drop down and get to links because they don't have enough time or there's not enough space, that makes it inoperable for them. This also applies to those beautiful ambient videos that we're all putting in the background now of our content. If those autoplay, they can be super distracting for someone that says they have ADHD or they have memory issues or they have epilepsy. God forbid you put anything super blinking back there that they can't turn off. That's awful. Understandable is the next one. This basically means, can I absorb the content? Can I understand the interface? So, anytime we're doing some kind of crazy navigation that looks really cool, that's going to be pretty difficult for users that aren't experienced with that. But if they're also disabled, you're making it, again, twice as hard. So that's the thing you have to think about. This, obviously, all the things we talk about are great for everyday users, those without disabilities. But if you factor in that it's already a lot harder for those with disabilities to use the web and applications, and factor that into all of this, it makes it even more of a reason to pursue these fundamentals. This last one should be the easiest for most developers because we test our products. I hope you test your products. You test them on multiple devices in multiple browsers. That's great. That's part of it being robust because we don't know what our users are going to be using. Are they on a phone? Are they on a laptop? Are they in IE9, God forbid? So testing your product will fall into this, but also testing it on accessible, with accessible tools, with screen readers, with a switch device. It's basically a giant button that works like your keyboard, with your keyboard, things like this. So that actually gets us into testing your product. These first few examples are things you could do right now. Like you could walk out of here today, go do these things very simply. Try navigating with only your keyboard. I mentioned why this is important, but when you actually do it, like cut off your mouse for a day or say it dies if you have a cordless one, it's really not fun. It makes things take longer, and a lot of sites don't work with a keyboard, surprisingly. Try going outside. I know that's a weird one, especially for me. I like the indoors. But if you've ever been outside on a sunny day and tried to use an application on your phone, that actually is a great simulation of what it can be like to have low vision and certain forms of low vision and blindness. So if the contrast is too low, you can't read things, stuff like that is really good to kind of just check in different lighting situations. What happens when it's really dark, things like that. And we actually are seeing, I won't talk a lot about color contrast because I know at least in my case, when I'm developing, that's up to the designer. So I can, give my input as far as accessibility goes or say whatever I like, but usually a designer is going to be telling me what colors I'm using. So I've kind of left that out, but I will be tweeting out a really good resource for checking color contrast very easily. It also gives you the requirements, like so if the font is this size, it has to have this kind of contrast, that sort of thing. But one thing that we're seeing a lot in interfaces right now is dark mode. I'm sure you've all seen this and use it. This is actually really cool for accessibility because a lot of low vision users can see light text on a dark background, but not dark text on a light background. So that's something to consider. Am I giving them alternative means to change the colors within the application, or am I preventing them from doing so with accessible tools that they may be using to do that? Try going through your product, reading only the headings and buttons and links. So if you didn't read anything else, could you find what you were looking for? Could you complete your task? Would it be hard? Probably, especially if you have a content author that isn't aware of these things. Simple headings that help me figure out what's below them, which I'll talk about more later, are going to help me navigate a page without having to read the whole thing. It plays into how screen readers work, which I'll show some demonstrations today. Users can navigate a page via headings, links and buttons, and landmarks, which we'll talk about. So that allows them to not have to read the whole page. They can skip around, kind of like you would if you were reading an outline, which I'll also go into. Try hiding all the images. So if you hid all the images on the page, would you still understand the content? Would it prevent you from doing something? God forbid you have image links in your navigation and they don't have alt text. That means I can't find anything on your site if I'm using a screen reader. If you hide the images and it's fine, well, great. They needed blank alt text because they weren't providing any extra context or information to the page. You also want to be careful of making sure, and I won't go too much into alt text because, again, that's more geared towards, I feel like, content authors. But if an image isn't providing information, like I said, it can be left blank. If it is adding extra context, something that's not in the content surrounding it, it should have alt text. But you want to be careful of this because I feel like a lot of times people feel like they have to do it and they'll just put something in. And usually they'll repeat, like, say, the headline if it's next to a news article. Well, then if I'm using a screen reader, it stutters. I hear it twice, and I don't need that. Same with links. If you have an image that links and a link underneath it, don't give it the same text because, again, it'll say, clickable graphic, dog. Clickable link, dog. You don't need to hear it twice. This one's a really easy one that we probably all do anyway. If you ever watch a video on your phone in a crowded place, you're not going to have the sound on usually. And so you'll use captions. And if that video doesn't have captions, what do? Just skip it. Just scroll past it. This one's I didn't really know about till recently. I saw someone do it, and it never really occurred to me. We only build responsive products, at least at our shop. So all of them work this way, thankfully. But I did try it like in a panic. If you zoom in 400, 500% in your application or website, almost all operating systems and browsers provide a way for users to do this. Can you still use the content? Can you still interact with it? And this is something that low vision users do a lot. So they'll zoom in a ton, horizontally scroll the screen and read lines at a time because some types of low vision, they can see shadow and light. So you can see the dark letters against a light background and vice versa. So I'm going to briefly talk about accessibility tools. I actually, hopefully, am tweeting out right now a list of the most common screen readers and browser combinations that you should be testing on. The biggest part of this is just test with the devices your users are using. Ideally, you're doing this already, like I said, with different phones, different browsers, but you also need to be doing this with different screen readers. Like I mentioned, switch devices, that's something that's really interesting. I wish I had a demonstration of that today because it's pretty awful if you tried to use one and makes the web very difficult. But just testing with these products, WebAIM, which I think I linked to this also, releases a survey almost every year. They've kind of skipped around where they survey those with disabilities, asking them, what are you using? What screen reader? What browser? What operating system? And so I pulled the top combinations from 2017 and have put that and linked out to those for you. Most of them are free, so there's no excuse not to do this. I mean, it's not super fun to use a screen reader and check your whole page with it, but you're going to find things you would have never found with an automated tool. So that's another thing I'm going to mention in that tweet. There are tons of accessibility tools that will scan the page for you, scan your whole site for you, and tell you what's wrong. And that's great. I love that that exists. I think tools like that are really awesome for catching things that maybe content authors have missed. If they're using a WYSIWYG or something like that, you'll find a ton of those type of issues. But for some things, it's not great. So it's not a person. It's not a screen reader. It's not going to see color contrast issues. Well, sometimes it will, but it'll see what's in your style sheet, not what's actually happening. It won't see things that maybe are rendered with JavaScript and happen after the fact, because it's usually at certain sizes, certain times when the page is loading that these are scanning. So you should never rely on them, ever. You should always be testing these yourself, because that's when you're ultimately going to find the biggest issues. A lot of the things you'll find in these automated scans are like the small things that you should be catching, missing alt text. But they're not the make or break things that are preventing people from using your product. This is my Twitter handle. I am tweeting things out right now that relate to all this. It's brand new, so don't be freaked out. I only got it for this conference, so there's like nothing else on there. So we're now going to talk about the biggest issues I've seen when remediating client products and just testing the web in general. The first of these is poor structure. The examples I'm going to show kind of feel like a duh moment, because it's best practices for using HTML5, which hopefully we're all doing, or at least what we're rendering in the browser is doing. And that's just using semantic code, ultimately. So if it quacks like a duck, looks like a duck, don't call it a weird water bird, basically. If it is a list, make it a list. If it is a heading, make it a heading. I'll go over that more. But all of this is important because there are two structures in the browser that the screen reader is using: the DOM tree, which we're all familiar with, and the accessibility tree, which you probably never look at. I hope you do, but you know. So these structures are parallel. They work together. The accessibility tree basically, which here's an example. It's basically for every DOM element that has implicit semantic meaning. So that means it has something to expose. It has a property or relationship or a feature that applies to accessibility. So here I'm looking at, I'm actually on the Kendo UI site. I'm looking at a button. And you'll see over here on the left in the accessibility tree, down at the computer properties, it says, you know, roll button. It knows that it's focusable. So all of these things are implicit about a button. But if, God forbid, I don't use a button and I use a span, try to make it clickable using JavaScript or whatever finagled thing, it's not going to get picked up in the accessibility tree. So it's probably not going to be read by the screen reader. So here you'll see it actually says like element not interesting for accessibility. So it's not going to make it a special thing. It'll be read if they're reading a full page, but they're definitely not going to see it if they're jumping from link to link, which is a very common way of navigating a page. So ways to fix these poor structure issues is make sure the DOM order matches the visual order. So I put this in here because it's something I see a lot with responsive sites. Especially if we're doing mobile first, right? We'll make sure that the DOM order works well for mobile, and then maybe use some CSS to like move it somewhere else visually on the page. This happens a lot when you've got like a 3-column, 2-column layout. We'll kind of move things around. The screen reader is going to read it in the DOM order. So that can be really confusing if you're purposefully communicating it visually one way on desktop, and then they're hearing it in the way that it's actually coded. It can make things very hard to understand and make it very difficult to figure out where they are on the page. This can happen a lot with like side nav that gets put like at the bottom, especially if I'm trying to get to that. I have to read through all the content and find it. So this is something to avoid whenever possible. I'll also show an example of what happens when you're using a screen reader and something's kind of in a weird order. So the other thing is to use HTML5 sectioning elements. If you're supporting a super old browser for some reason, I know that this can be difficult, but there are ways around that using roles. I won't go into that, but you can Google it. There's tons of stuff out there about it. I mentioned this before. If you're creating a list, use a list. Don't use paragraphs with line breaks and then add some kind of after or before element that makes it look like a list. Lists are a lot easier to use with a screen reader because it'll go through, tell you how many items there are, let you skip around. It's really great. So same with tables. If you're using a table to show tabular data, use actual table markup. Give it headings. If you don't, which I'll show in a moment, it's very hard to figure out what's in each cell because it treats them all the same. and it'll say column 1, column 2. And if you have a great memory, hopefully you can remember what's in the first row and be able to compare and figure out what you're looking at. But if you don't, it makes it impossible to understand the table. Same goes for presentational tables. If you're just using it to position things, mark it as presentational. Role equals presentation. Just do that. It makes it a lot easier. If you want to avoid all of this, just use the Kendo UI data table. Works great. It's very accessible. Describe clickable elements as links, buttons, or form controls. This one I feel like I shouldn't have to say, but I'm constantly seeing like a weird clickable div, and someone thought that was a brilliant idea instead of a button. I'm not going to see these things using a screen reader. I'm not going to hear them as clickable elements. So be very careful about this. Just use a button. Use a link. So I'm going to show you, this is a screen recording using NVDA in Firefox. It might be Chrome. And I have my reader set to like normal speed. But most people that are blind or low vision are going to have this like tripled. And it sounds like complete gibberish. But they just learn to understand it because they have to. They don't have time to hear it at the speed you're about to hear it at. I actually tweeted out several demonstration videos that we had at our UX panel of people using mobile screen reader, just a regular screen reader. And then there was one with speech to text, which is also a very big thing for those with mobility issues or that maybe can't type. So I'll just go ahead and play this. To give you some background, I'm looking at a comparison table of some ADT product. This nice little pop-up came up, but you'll never hear it. And I'll kind of explain what's going on as it's happening.
Table with 9 rows and 4 columns. Row 1, column 1. Column 2, graphic clickable basic icon head.
So these are actually my
column
headers,
3, graphic
which
clickable
visually are
plus
very
icon
obvious.
Head. Column
So the screen
4,
reader, they're
graphic
treated like
clickable
just
OTG
another
icon head.
table cell.
Row 2, column 1, monthly monitoring charge. Column 2, $29.95.
So you guys can see that, and you know that that's the basic package. But if you couldn't, you might could remember this one because it's only the second row, but it's probably unlikely, especially if you have cognitive issues that prevent you from remembering things.
Column 2.
I'm now going to skip down here.
Column 3, blank. Column 4,
and you hear those blanks?
blank.
Those are those check marks. So this is something else I'll talk about, relying on visual cues. This person put these in here because visually they quickly tell you which package gets which thing. But to the screen reader it just said blank. So it's not providing them any information. I don't think these are actually images, they were icons. So in this case they should have had text associated with them or used an image and had alt text. I'm going to go through kind of the structure using HTML5 sectioning elements of my ideal page and then show it visually, but I wanted to show this first. This is very simplistic and something that, again, should be kind of a duh moment if we are using best practices in HTML5. So I'm using a header for the header. That makes it read out header on the screen reader. So I quickly know, visually I can see the header on a page pretty easily, even if it's not marked up correctly. If I'm using a screen reader, it can be a lot harder. I have a nav element. I've got an H1 in there that's describing that nav element. So here I'm using the Y-ARIA attribute, ARIA labeled by. I have a lot of these in my examples because they're great. You should be adding these things, but you shouldn't be relying on them. Most screen readers now support them. That wasn't the case. Older screen readers, older browsers don't always support them consistently and can read things a little weird. So I don't rely on them for now. But I do add them because on modern browsers, modern screen readers, they do add a lot of extra benefit and make things a lot easier to understand. So here I have the ARIA labeled by for my main nav because I'm planning on having multiple instances of navigation on my page. That's a very common practice. Here, this is my side navigation. I'm building out like a really classic layout here. I put this in an aside because it is an aside to my main content area, which you'll see in a moment. And again, I'm labeling this instance of navigation. And I've actually made, this could be, whatever the main sectioning page. I just put side navigation in there. But this H2, I'm putting this in here because I'm thinking of the global construct of the page that I had an H1 in the main header and an H2 in my side nav. But this is a new sectioning element, which I'll get into headers in a minute. So this could be another H1. It would actually still make sense. This is the main content area. This should be where the bulk of your information lives. You should only have one main tag on a page. Within that, I have my first section. And a section is just used to group things that are related. Very simple. And I have it labeled here that corresponds with an ID for my main title. So if I had a page about animals, this section would be dogs. I'd have a section about cats. They'd all be grouped individually. So it makes it a lot easier to navigate the page and find the specific section I'm looking for. Here's my footer. I'm using a footer tag. And then I have another instance of navigation within that. So all of these are really basic things, but I don't see them on the web like often. And that's kind of a shame. So a part of that is the thoughtful content hierarchy. So you want to think of your content on a page, and this relates to content authors, but as developers, a lot of times you might be given content, asked to build it out, and then someone else might go in and change it later in the CMS, whatever you're using. But you want to make sure you're thinking about your headings like an outline and the content underneath them. So in middle school, you probably created an outline for a paper, and you would have 1, 2, 3, and below that ABC. So think of your headings, H1 to H6, the same way. You want to nest them within each section. This helps if I'm navigating via headings, because I can quickly hear that, okay, this is the main heading for that section, this is a subheading, and kind of drill down from there and find the content I'm looking for very quickly. This might not be something you get to make a decision about, but when you are writing headings, they need to be very clear, simple, and concise. If I'm navigating via headings and you use some kind of marketing lingo to describe some weird product you have that I've never heard of for a whole section, that's not going to help me find, what I'm looking for. So keeping these very simple, very clear is always the best way to go. And then just in general, as I mentioned, using lists, using paragraphs, using semantic elements for content is always the best way to go. Here's an example of a page from a site we built out. Just to show you what this looks like visually. So here I'd have my header, my aside, my main section. All of these are nested, so within that I would have my 2 sections, and then within that I have my navigation, so I have ancillary nav and top nav and side nav. And then within that I nest my headings, so these are in order. I'm using an unordered list. This looks very simple. This is a very typical pattern, but I very rarely see sites marked up this way. Government sites, yes, thankfully, because they are required to follow 508. But a lot of times, just mom and pop sites, never. And they're the ones that are going to get hit hardest when all of these lawsuits start trickling down. So something to think about. Another part of that is just grouping like things together. Visually, this is so easy to do, and we do it all the time. But if it's not done in the markup, and I can't see that visual grouping, then I'm not going to associate those elements. So this means, if I'm doing radio buttons or checkboxes or fields that are related, say address, that's going to have street, city, zip, all that, you want to put those in a field set. Within that, if you have, say, a main label, which I'll show an example in a minute, you'd want to use a legend. And the reason for this is not just grouping. I'll actually show a video of what happens when you don't do this. There are 2 ways that a user can interact with the form. When they're using a screen reader, they can read the whole page and hear all the form elements, and then they can go into forms mode, where they can tab through the form and edit things very quickly. When they're in forms mode, they're not going to hear text that is not a label, a form element, or a field set, or a legend. So anything else. So if you have little instructions in there that aren't associated with those fields, they're not going to get read. And I'll show all of that in a moment. But putting the label before the field, if I'm reading the page top to bottom, that ensures I'm going to hear the label before I get into the field. That's how we build all our forms. I'll show you an example of kind of the ideal in a moment. I know that's not always possible depending on your design, so I'll show how the markup should be. But this is the best practice for if you're just worried something will go wrong or their screen reader won't interpret it right. If you hear the label before the field, you'll always know what the field is for. Also keeping related items in their HTML5 sectioning elements. I showed an example of a section. When you're grouping things in your markup, they're going to be read that way. So they'll be understood as they would be visually. So this is kind of the biggest section I'm going to talk about, and it's where I see the most issues. Forms for us are already a pain sometimes on the web, especially if they're exceptionally long. They're an extra pain for those with disabilities, especially those that are low vision and blind. It is twice as hard, it takes like twice as long to fill out very simple forms that would take us a couple minutes, and I'll show some examples of that. So the first big part of this is making sure that it's keyboard accessible. If I can't tab through a form and fill it out, I can't fill it out. To help this, if you use standard controls, if you're using a text field, a text area, a select box, these are all going to already work fine. They're going to fall into that accessibility tree. I'm going to be able to tab into them without issue. If you're building, say, a modal, this is probably like the #1 thing I see as far as keyboard issues. A keyboard trap. So if I open a modal, if I don't end up in there, like focus is in the modal itself, I can't get to it. So that's actually a reverse keyboard trap. What that means is the modal has opened and my focus is still behind it and I'm still reading the page like nothing happened. That ADT page, we saw that chat window. We didn't hear it. It was actually at the very bottom of the DOM tree because it was rendered later, and that's fine because to me that's not super important content. Their chat function probably wasn't accessible to begin with. But if that had been an important modal, I wouldn't have heard it because it wasn't in the right order in the DOM tree, and I also never received focus when it opened. So the same can be said for just regular elements. If I tab into a field, I should be able to tab out. If I can't fill out the rest of the form. So this video won't have sound because I was just using my keyboard and not my screen reader. But let's say I wanted to give Newegg some feedback because they don't have focus states on any of their links. I open this modal, and this is the only way you can tell. I'm tabbing around, trying to tab within that modal, but I'm actually behind it. I'm just tabbing down the page, seeing all these URLs that are underneath it. That happens all the time. I see this a lot, and you can't rely on users to notice that. You guys probably barely notice that. So I was trapped in that modal. The only way I was able to close it was refresh the page. So this goes into what we saw in that ADT video, to never rely on visual cues. This is something we see a lot in forums. If you are using icons to indicate information, a lot of times you'll see that little question mark for a tooltip. Hover over it and you'll get more information about the field. Those are usually horribly inaccessible because I have to hover over it, and then the text within it is either read incorrectly or in a weird order of the fields. So relying on icons, if they are important and they're informational, like let's say an error icon beside a field, it should have text associated with it. If it's just visual and you just like to use icons, don't worry about it. Mark it as presentational or hide it from the screen reader. Changing colors is something we do a lot for error states, a little red outline on a field, or maybe you shade it in. These mean nothing to me on a screen reader. I don't hear that it has a red outline. So never rely on those to indicate information. And then this is the most popular pattern for forums, the little red asterisk by the required fields. Most users probably figure out what that means because they're so used to it. But the screen reader is just going to say, whatever the label is, name, star. And you'll hear this in a minute. And that doesn't tell me it's required. So if you have text above, hopefully I'll remember that you said, star means required. But visually, I'm not going to see those, and they're not going to mean a whole lot to me. So here's actually a form that was doing that. They didn't have text at the top saying that star meant required, so you just hear like email address, star, zip code, star. So it's not very helpful. You have these little informational icons that don't get read. And then you have this required error message below the field. It's a span. So when I'm in forms mode, I never hear it. I had a video of this, but I skipped it because I have another one that's a little better later. But basically this form, if I had filled something out incorrectly, hit next step, I would never hear that there was an issue unless I went back up and then read the page. So that means it's taking me twice as long to fill out a form that simple. When you're doing required fields, there are many ways to mark them as required. I'm going to show you 5 of them. This one's the simplest. Just use the required attribute. With this one, I'm doing ARIA required. If for some reason you don't want to use the required attribute, that works fine too. If, God forbid, you can't use either, you could put required in the label. That's a very clear way to indicate this. However, I don't recommend this if a ton of fields are required or all of them are required. That gets super redundant, and it's poor usability in general, not just for accessibility. So in those cases, I would actually advocate that you mark optional fields and make sure that you're just informing the user that all fields are required. That's a lot simpler way to do this. Or if you're just marking them as optional, a lot of times people are going to know, okay, well then if these are optional, those are required. It's a little more understood. Whereas hearing required on every field would not be fun. Here, so this is what most people do. They have the required fields have an asterisk. They're indicating that, and then they put the asterisk. But this is a paragraph. So if I'm in forms mode, I'm not going to hear that. But I will hear that. So if you have to do this for some reason, this is the way to do it. Put it in a legend. The tricky thing here, though, is if you have a bunch of field like groups and they're not all related, this can get kind of icky pretty quick because you're putting multiple field sets in with maybe multiple legends, or you're putting everything in one field set. So this still isn't the best option. Using the required attribute is just universally great. And it works, and I hear it, and it makes it very simple to understand what fields are required and which aren't. So here's that same form. I just opened up that tooltip, which is a little graphic, so you don't hear it. This is the biggest one. It got an exclamation mark because this is one that I see the most, and it's so heinous because if you don't have a label for the field, you don't know what it's for. And of course, everyone's like, oh, well, you know, if I can't put a label, why don't I put placeholder text? That's a great idea. No, also bad. Placeholder text has low contrast, for one, so a lot of people with low vision have issues seeing it. But the minute I click in the field, it disappears. So a lot of times, low vision and blind users will fill out a form, and then they'll go back and check through it because it's, like I said, forms are a lot harder for them. It takes a lot longer. And so when they go back through to check through it, guess what they don't hear? Labels. They hear what they entered. So hopefully they entered the right thing and they can deduce what the label was. But if you have a static label that's always there, that's never going to happen. So here's an example of the Chewy site. Let's say I was going to buy dog food.
Heading level 1 visited link.
Starting at the top.
Form landmark, find the best for your pet. Combo boxed collapsed editable. Button.
Super informative that it just
Find
said button.
the best for your pet.
Hopefully the user will associate that with the field
button.
And know that that's the search button.
Navigation landmark list with 3 items, 24
But you noticed it just read the placeholder text, and that placeholder text isn't awful. I would probably be able to figure it out. They could have made this a search field, which would have made it even easier to understand what it was. But if you were going to mark this up, let's say it was this is just a generic example. The best way is always to have your label be associated with the ID on the field. So I have the for attribute here. This is the most simple way you can do this and best way. And I rarely see it, which is kind of strange. For some reason, if you can't associate the for attribute with the ID, let's say you have a content author that's adding these form elements, should be awful, wrap it in a label. So just associate the input by wrapping it in the label. That automatically will read it correctly, works fine. Again, I'm just going down, why do people do this? I don't know. But if you can't use a label and you're going to just use strong text, I don't know, you can add an ARIA label. That will work too. But like I said before, don't rely on those. It's not a good practice. And then if you can't use a label because of the design. So I get why they did this. They're trying to keep kind of a low profile up there in the header. And that's fine. Sometimes the design demands that you can't have a true label above your field. So what you can do is have a label that's hidden. And so it's only visible for screen reader only. And when I say hidden, I don't mean display none or hidden true. That does not work for a screen reader. It's actually hidden if you do that. So there are a number of ways to do this. If you Google it, you'll find dozens. My favorite is just to absolutely position it off of the viewable area of the screen. And then no matter what, it's going to get read. There are more modern ways to do it, but I'm just always a little paranoid about older browsers. So after that, obviously, I'm associating it with the field using the for attribute. And then to improve it further, I've added text to my button. And it's hidden because most users are going to know what the little search icon is. It's fairly understood. But like I said, I can't see it. I just heard the word button. So if I add the word search there, I'm going to know what it's for. Another thing that I liked about this, so normally I would remove placeholder text if it's redundant, if it's the same as the label. So if this said search, I would just remove it because I have a search label in there. But they had placeholder text that was different, and I liked it. So here it would say search, the label, and then it would read the placeholder text on most screen readers, and then it would go through the button. So I feel like this would be fine to actually keep. But anytime you have placeholder text that matches your label, it sounds like the screen reader is stuttering, and it's just kind of awkward. So the next big thing, and I mentioned this before with proximity and grouping, is grouping controls in a field set specifically. So I like this example because they did it right here, and they did it wrong here. Same form. So
invalid entry has U.S military affiliation grouping. No radio button checked 1 of 2. No radio button not checked 1 of 3.
So I go back up.
E.S military affiliation grouping. Yes radio button checked 2 of 2. No radio button checked 1 of 2.
So I think it stopped. So I thought I went back down, but I guess it didn't play it all the way through. So as you heard, when I was here first and I tabbed down, so I was in forms mode, it didn't read, do you have transfer credits? So all it read to me was radio button no, and it would have read radio button yes, radio button not sure. So I wouldn't know what I was actually answering here because this was just a span. It wasn't a legend in a field set. So just so you can kind of see which ones. So this is how it should have been marked up. So I have a field set. That first main label that was on the side, that's my legend. So that will be read before I hear the labels that are correctly associated with my input. This is the way to do radio buttons and checkboxes. Very few people do this. Form validation. This is another really, really big one that can have huge consequences. I mentioned that panel earlier. We had a blind man in there, David, who told us a story about paying his credit card bill once. He had gone through the form, it had taken him some time. He got to the end, hit submit, nothing happened. He didn't hear success, he didn't hear error, he heard nothing. So he thought, okay, they probably did the error messaging wrong. I need to go up and fix something. So he went back up into the form, filled it out again, checked all his answers, hit submit, nothing. He did this a couple more times before he had to ask for help. Which is something to think about. Anytime someone that is blind or low vision can't fill out a form, that means they usually have to ask someone for help. A neighbor, a friend, God forbid a stranger in the library who's now going to see all their sensitive credit card information. So anytime you're building something that's inaccessible, you're requiring them to ask someone else to do it for them, which is a very unfortunate thing. So with this form, he asked someone to help him, and it was submitting. He paid his credit card bill 5 times and then had to call the credit card company and deal with that. And of course they want to give you back your money after you've paid them extra. So it was a really unfortunate situation for him that could have been easily alleviated with just a properly marked up success message that he heard after submitting. So this is a very realistic situation. This is a form, if I'm registering for my insurance company's online portal, I want to go see a claim maybe that's been submitted, very realistic thing. I'm going to first read through it. You'll hear me in read mode because a lot of times with forms like this, that's what I'll do just to start, because if they're a little confusing, it's easier to hear everything that way. Because like I said, a lot of times they'll put little paragraphs and things in there that aren't associated with the fields. So if you hear this one.
Star required. Member information.
It did read star required, so I know that now.
Enter the member ID on your card or the social security number of the subscriber. This helps us. Locate your policy. Star choose one.
Not sure why that was repeated. So this opens up and it says alert, but then that image didn't have alt text, so I didn't actually hear anything
alert
else.
The subscriber may also
this one
be
I do
referred.
Hear the text, but
member
it's
ID,
a little disconcerting to hear the word alert, because
blank.
usually that's for something important, and then to hear
1,
nothing
2,
after it
3, 4,
is very confusing. So it
alert
started
the subscriber
entering.
may also be referred to as the policy
And you notice when I
holder
tab
or
to the
plan
next
holder.
field, which is normally how
Your
you would
health
fill out a
plan
form,
is under this
it
person's
doesn't read
name.
the word or.
Edit has autocomplete.
So unless I remembered that it said I
Blank.
had to choose one of these, I'm
2,
just going to fill out both.
3, dash,
because I see 2
4,
fields.
5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Edit has autocomplete.
This one just goes all
Blank.
crap. I don't know what was going on with this field.
Blank.
It tries to read the inside.
Blank. Invalid entry.
It then tells me it's
Website
invalid,
usage
so that was
agreement.
good.
Link. List with 2 items clickable mm/dd/YYYY.
So now I went up and read it, 'cause when I was tabbing in
Edit
forms mode, it
invalid
wasn't
entry
working.
has autocomplete.
You notice it never
Clickable.
says this field is
Start your
required,
date
even though
of
that
birth.
just opened. I go back into forms mode, that's why it's
Edit
erroring.
invalid
because I
entry
wouldn't read
0, 4/1, 6/8.
So I'm able to fill it out. I get all the way out.
Website usage agreement. Continue button.
Did you hear anything? I didn't either. So that form already, that's something that would take us a couple seconds.
cancel.
And it took me that long,
Button
and then I
continue.
don't hear
By
the error
clicking
message that
list
my
with
social
2
security
items
number,
edit
that I
has
entered both and
autocomplete.
didn't need to.
Clickable.
So
Star your
to
date
get
of
out of
birth.
this, I'd have to go all
Enter
the way
your date
up,
of birth.
read it
2.
again. So
Clickable
I'm adding a third
123,
time that the user has to go through this form just because I didn't mark this correctly.
Edit has
So the way you can avoid, well, here's what happened, just as a breakdown. So I didn't hear any text for that image, even though I heard the word alert. I didn't hear that there was an error, and I had to reread the whole page if I wanted to find that one at the top. So this is our ideal form, or an example of what it could be. I have some group fields. I didn't fill any of them out, so they're all in error. I have a global error message at the top. This we use for forms that have more than like a couple fields, or if they're scrolling and it's going to be on mobile. We do this because it makes it super obvious to the user that there's an issue. You have that big red box at the top, they're not going to miss it. We've tested this a lot in user tests. That's what kind of led us down this path. It's also great for accessibility if you mark it up right. So you heard those tooltips, they said alert. That's because they had role alert on them. So after hitting continue, no matter how you did this form, if you did client-side validation and you had that global error message rendered with JavaScript or what have you, it would say alert immediately and then read it the minute you click submit. If you had to reload the form and you had server-side validation and there was an issue, it would do the same thing. That alert would get read first. The other thing you want to make sure you do is set focus on that global alert at the top. So if you have multiple errors, set your focus to that after hitting submit. If you have just one error, I actually prefer to set focus on the field with that error, just as a courtesy, because then they're right there, they can go ahead and fix it. They don't have to tab through the whole form. The field level error messages, we put this under the label right before the field. That ensures that it's going to be read in the correct order, so they know what they're working on, they know what the error is, and then they can go fix it. But we also have to associate that message with the field. So here I have all of this marked up like you saw with my label, my input. And I have ARIA invalid on there. That's also another good practice because it's just another way to indicate that there's an error. I would obviously update that with JavaScript or whatever. ng invalid, like Angular default validation, just does classes. I think people forget that because they're like, oh, it's communicating it clearly to me. It's styling it different. It's not communicating anything to the screen reader. So updating that ARIA invalid will do that for you, and that's a great way to do this. But you also need to tell them why it's invalid. So here I have an ID on my error message, and then I'm just doing ARIA described by on my input. So it is associating the two. Next section, buttons and links. As I mentioned before, if you're not actually using buttons and links, this can be a major problem. Way to get around this is just to actually use buttons and actually use links for clickable elements and not use something crazy. I think for the sake of time, we're actually out of time.
Link visited link. V.
Yeah. So I'm going to skip that. But basically, I went through the header. It didn't read anything that didn't have text. So the way I would mark this up, just so I can give you all that one last example. Here I'm doing it 3 ways. With a Kendo button, normal button, with ARIA label, and with a span that's hidden by the screen reader. So there are a number of ways to do this. Just add text. That's the most important part. Focus states is another one that's really awful. Don't disable the default focus state. Go to ESPN.com and tab through it, and you'll see what I'm showing you in this video. But basically, if I can't see where my focus is, I can't navigate through the page easily. I have to rely on that little link at the bottom, like you saw in that first video. So don't disable the default browser state, but take it a step further. Design a custom one, because a lot of time those default states aren't super obvious. In Windows Chrome, it's like a blue outline. If I have a blue background, guess what? I'm not going to be able to see it. So go for super obvious. You know, this one's a little much, I feel like. But you know, if you're not a designer and you're trying to do it, just outline is always a really good way. Just make it something that can be seen on the different colors you're using. So just to circle back, don't be a jerk. Make your products accessible. If you do that, you probably won't get sued, and you probably won't make your customers mad. Thank you. We don't really have time for questions, but I'm just going to stand here until I'm done, and then I'm going to go outside, and you can come ask me questions. So thanks. And I will distribute this later with the links, but like I said, I've been tweeting out all of the tools and stuff, too, so you can get them any number of ways. And I'll tweet out the presentation whenever I put it up.